Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's Beatriz again from the Supervisory ICT Risk and Cybersecurity function within the Malta Financial Services Authority, bringing you another Digital Operational Resilience Act videocast. So, before I introduce today's episode and before I introduce my very special guests for today, I wanted to take a moment and thank you for the very positive feedback that we've gotten for the first video cast of this series. We've gotten a number of likes, comments, very positive feedback, both from internally at the authority and also from our license holders and authorized persons. So thank you very much. And I hope that today's episode is as engaging as the first one. So, just to recap, if there are any questions, any queries, any suggestions on future episodes, do not hesitate to send us an email on the email address you see on the screen right now. I would also like to point out that we have also refurbished our webpage on the Supervisory ICT Risk and Cybersecurity website under the MFSA website. More specifically, we have refurbished our legislation subpage. So now under the legislation subpage, you can see information on our rules, guidelines, and in DORA itself. We have also introduced a DORA frequently asked questions. So if you're interested in that, you can just click on the link that will pop up on the screen right now. And if there are any questions that you think should be featured within our frequently asked section, please also do not hesitate to send us an email on the email that you see on the screen. Now, today, we are going to talk mostly about Chapter 2 of the DORA regulation, which deals with ICT risk management. So today is all about risk. And for that, I have two very special guests with me today that are also my colleagues within the CIRC function here at the MFSA. So with me today, I have Monika Kia and Nikola Vukovic. So the idea behind bringing two guests here today is so that we can have a view of two different stages of what we call the supervisory life cycle of a financial entity. So this means basically that we can get more than one perspective on the stages that a financial entity goes through from a pre-authorization stage of the authority, even after it's licensed. So Monique deals specifically with authorizations and offsite supervision, whereas Nikki deals specifically with supervisory engagements, most notably on-site inspections. So the idea, once again, is to have a question and to have two different answers to that question with two different perspectives throughout the supervisory life cycle. So without further ado, I would like our guests to introduce themselves and, just to introduce a little bit of what we do within our function. Monique, I think you can start.
Thank you, Beatrice, for having us here. To introduce myself a bit, I joined the authority last year, as you correctly said, specifically the Supervisory ICT Risk and Cybersecurity function. My studies are in banking and finance and insurance, undergoing right now studies within ICT. And considering my background, where I have worked with a prominent local bank within the industry, specifically on corporate banking, today, as you said, I assist in the authorizations, pre-authorization, and post-commencement of business authorization of financial entities, and also engaging with the industry for offsite supervision.
Nikki?
Okay, hi Beatrice, and thank you again for inviting us today. So my name is Nikki Vukovic, and I have been working in the financial services industry for the past 20 years. I worked for many years at the Central Bank of Malta in the section of monetary and financial statistics. I also worked as a lead auditor in the internal audit function of the central bank, and I am now an certified information systems auditor. I also worked with an international insurance company, and where I was the Risk and Cybersecurity Officer. I joined the CIRC function of the MFSA in July of last year. And my role here is specifically to conduct on-site inspections in relation to ICT risk and cybersecurity. The focus now is currently on the requirements emanating from DORA. So we need to see what are the additional requirements, what is different from the current guidelines, and obviously to prepare for our on-site inspections, which will be conducted in relation to the requirements of DORA as from 2025.
Thank you for answering, Nikki. So before we go and actually discuss the contents of the regulation, I just wanted to give a very, very brief overview of what Chapter 2 is all about. So I like to divide it within three major topics. The first one is in relation to ICT governance and structure, and the second one is on the ICT risk management framework. And then Chapter 2 also introduces what we call a simplified ICT risk management framework. Basically, the simplified risk management framework will be applicable only to a subset of entities, and they will not be required to have a full-fledged ICT risk management framework, but rather a simplified one. More details on what the simplified ICT risk management framework will incur will come up in an upcoming regulatory technical standard. So these regulatory technical standards, and you're gonna notice that we're gonna make mention to them over and over again for all these presentations, are going to be developed by the European Supervisory Authorities to further supplement and specify the requirements of the DORA regulation. If you're curious about knowing the exact timeline of when these supplementary texts will come up, please do refer to the link that will pop up on the screen right now. It will take you to our latest circular on the DORA regulation, and Annex 1 has a table which basically gives you an overview of the timeline of when these regulatory technical standards will come out. Now, before we dive into detail, I wanted to ask a question on the applicable guidelines. So to be quite honest, I see a lot of similarity between the DORA regulation and the current applicable guidelines, specifically and especially on Chapter 2. So on your own personal assessment, how do they differ? Are they similar? Are they not?
Okay, Beatrice, I think I can start by saying that there are many similarities between the existing ESA guidelines and DORA. Now, when I say ESA guidelines, for everyone to understand, I mean the EBGA guidelines, the EOPA guidelines, and the ESMA guidelines. This new regulation seems to harmonize all ICT and cybersecurity requirements into one regulation applicable to all financial sectors. Now, obviously, here we say those sectors, those entities that fall under the scope of DORA. However, DORA seems to be somewhat more onerous in certain requirements in relation specifically to ICT governance, ICT risk management, and ICT security requirements, which are to be further specified and detailed in the regulatory technical standards, as you already mentioned. There's increased emphasis and maybe more requirements in relation to outsourcing, including specific details of the entity's third-party service providers, as well as more specific requirements on incident reporting mechanisms. So for those, these requirements are going to be further detailed in the implementing technical standards, which are to be issued somewhat in the beginning of next year. So we don't have the exact details of this for the time being.
From my end, I don't really have much to add in the sense that you both already mentioned the fact that there's a lot of similarity of what composes ICT risk management today to what we will eventually have under DORA. I think what is very interesting, however, especially from an authorizations point of view, is that we're going above the principle of proportionality. We're going to also have through Article 16, the introduction of a simplified ICT risk management, which will basically allow and exclude a number of entities from certain provisions of ICT risk management itself.
Thank you both for your answer. So let's start with the actual contents of Chapter 2 then. I want to ask you specifically on ICT governance because on Article 5 of Chapter 2, the DORA regulation puts direct requirements on the management body of a financial entity. So can you give us an overview of what is expected from the management body?
Of course. So I think it is important to start, Beatrice, by saying that the management body is responsible and will continue to remain responsible for the defining, the approving, the overseeing, and the implementation of all arrangements of the ICT risk management framework. What is interesting and what we need to look at, in my opinion, is to have someone within the management body that has sufficient skills and knowledge of the ICT risk and cybersecurity characteristics. This will allow the management body to make better decisions on their day-to-day. It will allow them to implement better controls, for example, better business continuity plans, and to be able to respond better to risks that the company is exposed to, for example, through outsourcing arrangements.
Okay, so Beatrice, from my end, so I conduct the on-site inspections together with my colleagues. So some important criteria that is required also in the current regulations, but maybe more specifically in DORA, is that the management body is ultimately responsible for the company and all its risks. So there has to be in place an internal governance framework. So there we check that there are policies and procedures, that there are reporting lines, that there are approvals by the management body of any new decision that has been taken. It can be in relation to ICT outsourcing, for example, which is more stressed in the DORA. So we need to see that the management understands what they are approving. So if they are approving something in relation to ICT, if they are aware of the cybersecurity risks that are currently on the increase, they will approve a budget on ICT, for example, and cybersecurity, which is enough, to safeguard the business. Now here, for example, we always look at these things while we're doing our inspections, so we need to get proof of that. We need to see that these approvals have been discussed in the committee. So we ask for the minutes of these meetings, for example. Now, I say under DORA, there are more requirements on ICT third-party providers. And this has been included in DORA for the simple reason that more and more companies are moving to the cloud, for example, and moving more to outsourced services. So obviously, the risks on outsourcing are going to increase. Incident management as well, for example. So the directors must always be kept included in these decisions, and they need to be knowledgeable about them in order to take the correct decisions, of course.
Thank you very much, Monique and Nikki, for your answers. I think they rely on experience, and this is what's just so important and nice about these series of video casts. So the next question that I have for you is also on ICT governance. And I want to know what is expected from the management body of a financial entity. More specifically, what is expected from the management body at an authorization stage, and what is expected from the management body during a supervisory engagement, an on-site visit, for instance. Do these expectations, do they differ from the stage of the supervisory life cycle?
This is a very good question, Beatrice, and the reason why it is a good question because it shows the difficulties that we're faced with at an authorization stage particularly. And the reason why is because there's no actual legal guidance that tell us what we should see at an authorization stage and what we should see following that from a governance and organization perspective. But back to your question, to answer your question, at an authorization stage, our objection is not to bluntly object to what the entity has, but what we want to do is to actually help the entity, assist the entity, and ensure that the entity is establishing the proper governance and organization setup in order to achieve the provisions that emanate from what we have today and eventually what we will have under DORA. To give some practical examples, for example, we ensure that there are clear roles and responsibilities on risk management, that reporting lines have been established, and not only established, but also communicated. We ensure that the function, if it has adopted a 3-line of defense risk management model, it has properly set up the first line and the second line and the third line of defense, the functions that are related to them, and ensuring that we don't see companies, entities acting as a shell company or just as letterbox entities. For example, we have seen this for companies for entities that have been set up in Malta and trying to obtain a license as a Brexit approach.
Okay, so Beatrice, from our end, so Monique starts with the authorization phase. Then this is before the company goes actually into business. So after a year or so, we can start doing our on-site inspections or some other type of inspection, but the company would now be in business. So we need to check that these controls, that these policies and procedures, for example, the reporting lines are actually working in practice. It's not just that the policies are there, but that they are actually working in accordance to their own policies and procedures, and also in accordance with regulations. During our inspection, we would start, for example, with a review of the organization chart, because even from the level of approval, from the time when this company was approved, the organization chart might have changed. It grows over time, it changes, and from there we can see the reporting lines, we can see the 3 lines of defense. So we would check the organization chart, ask questions on that. When review the policies and procedures, we have to see that the governance body has approved those policies and procedures. The reporting lines, are they actually working? So what do? We check, for example, board minutes, committee minutes. We do interviews with people from the different lines of defense, from the operations, from second line of defense, from the third line of defense. And we do our checks to make sure that the governance body is aware of what is going on, and that they are working in accordance to their policies and procedures and the regulations. Now, to do that, with regards to the government body, they need to understand what is going on. So they need to have some kind of knowledge. Now, with regards to DORA, that is what we do at the moment. But with regards to DORA, now there are going to be more specific and perhaps more detailed requirements. For example, if we're going to mention outsourcing, they need an outsourcing policy. The person who is responsible for outsourcing, these things all have to be approved, and information has to be brought forward to the board in order for them to make the proper decisions. Also, what we can mention as well is that DORA stresses a lot on business continuity, which for me, I think it is one of the main aspects of risk management. So the business continuity plan also now requires a BIA. Incident management procedures to be included as well, and testing strategies. So we need to see that the board is understanding what is happening, that any testing results are presented to the board, and so on, This is at our stage, and these engagements with the same company can happen over a period of years, can happen again. For example, we find something and then we check again another time. So that is the way we work.
But obviously, we are talking about a 3-line of defense model. So what is so I want to go a little bit beyond of what the regulation is talking about when it comes to the management body. So I want to ask, what is expected from the 2nd line of defense? What is expected from the 3rd line of defense? And again, do they differ from the supervisory life cycle stages?
Okay, so what we have today, Beatrice, what is presented within the applicable relevant guidelines, I think it is quite clear as to what we should expect at a 1st line, 2nd line, or 3rd line of defense. Under DORA, we still need to wait for the RTS, which needs to be concluded in order to give us more detail as to how this 3-line of defense model or another control model, risk management control model, will actually work. What is certain at an authorization stage, and I believe even when we engage in supervisory visits, is that these functions, they need to be independent and segregated from each other. Meaning that if we have the first line of defense, so we have the operational function, if we have the risk management function or a control function, and eventually having the internal audit function, they need to be segregated and independent from each other to avoid conflicts of interest. This is what we have today, and eventually what we could potentially have under DORA, but then again, we still need to await on the RTS.
Okay, Beatrice. So from my end, and to continue with what Monique was explaining, here we focus, yes, for the DORA regulation focuses on the first line of defense. And that is so because the first line of defense is the ICT function, in our case, which will be implementing the controls. So they identify the risks that they have and the increased risks that come along with a business, especially if we are moving to more outsourcing, for example, like that's what is happening at the moment, and the controls that they implement to reduce or eliminate the risk. So that is why it is given most importance, because that is where the controls are most relevant. And then we have the second line of defense, which is usually the ICT risk management function that would oversee and periodically check the controls and whether they are being implemented by the first line. So they do their checks, they know through a risk register, because obviously all risks and all controls must be recorded. So they know what risks there are and what controls must be in place. So they check on a regular basis that those controls are being implemented, whether those controls are working. They can even work alongside the first line of defense to improve the controls that they have, but ultimately they must be independent from each other, meaning that they don't report to the same person. If the ICT people, let's face it, report to the head of the ICT function, the second line of defense will be reporting to the risk management committee or to the board. And then we go to the third line of defense, which are the internal audit function. Now, this function can be in-house or it can be outsourced, obviously, usually depending on the size of the company. Its function is to set up an internal audit plan for a specified period, usually, let's say for 3 years, depending on the company, and to plan periodic IT audits. Sometimes, especially depending on the size of the company, you have to have an IT audit done every year. The internal auditors would be obviously the third line control function, and they report directly to the board. Now, during our supervisory engagements, we check that these 3 lines are independent from each other. Now, as Monique said, under DORA, there might be, we're getting the impression that there might be some more flexibility with regards to these 3 lines of defense process. However, we need to wait for the RTSs. But importantly, that they have to remain independent from each other.
Thank you. Thank you very much for answering my question. So this is everything that I had planned for today. As you can see, today's episode, we focused mainly on the differences between the DORA regulation and the current applicable guidelines. We've also touched upon Article 5 of Chapter 2 that touches upon ICT governance and the role mainly of the first line of defense. But there is more to Chapter 2. So Chapter 2 also touches upon ICT risk management framework. It touches upon incident management and the fact that a testing program needs to be an integral part of the ICT risk management framework. And so because this chapter is quite long, we're actually going to do, the next episode is also going to be on Chapter 2. So this is not the last time that you see Nikki and Monique, and they are also going to be present for the next episode. So I wanted to thank you very much for your participation today.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Sure. And see you next time. And also, just as a recap, if you have any questions, suggestions, or anything of the sorts, just email us on the email address that you can see on the screen. Thank you very much.